Silica dioxide, or silica for short, is actually a trace mineral that is critical for skin, hair, teeth, connective tissue, collagen, our extracellular matrix. Silica binds to the walls of our blood vessels to help with blood flow. It's known to be beneficial for gut health and digestion.
Welcome to the Radical Health Rebel podcast. I'm your host, Lee Brandon. This work started for me several decades ago when I started to see the impact I could make on people, helping them to identify the root cause of their health problems that no doctor could figure out, including serious back, knee, shoulder and neck injuries, acne and eczema issues, severe gut health problems, even helping couples get pregnant after several IVF treatments had failed. And it really moves me to be able to help people in this way. And that is why I do what I do and why we have this show. In this week's episode, entitled Silica-Rich Primary Water, A New Road to Health and Longevity, I spoke with Michael Hobson about his journey from owning a vinyl record company to becoming involved in water, and in particular, silica water. This was a really fascinating conversation about silica and water and their importance to human, animal and plant health. We also discussed the prevalence of aluminium toxicity today and the illnesses it can cause, and how silica, and especially silica water, can play a role in its removal from the body. This was an absolutely fascinating conversation, one that I think you'll find fascinating too. Michael Hobson, welcome to the Radical Health Rebel podcast. Thanks for coming on the show.
My pleasure to be here, Lee.
Yeah, it's really great to have you on the show. And so to kick things off, could you share with the audience a full rundown of your extremely diverse career today, and also how you became so fascinated in water, also your studies in water, water structure, and also water frequencies?
Yes. So I think people often have the same experience that I did. And that is, as we're progressing through life, it seems like a bit of a random walk, or, that you end up in different places doing different things. The old saying, one thing leads to another, right? A line from a great song by The Fix. So, in my case, I started out as a professor at university, teaching economics, which is my background. And then I left academia to go on to the corporate life. And I worked at what we call the old AT&T, after they broke up this monopoly back in the mid 80s. And I ended up at Bell Laboratories because I've trained as a research economist, really a forecaster, an econometrician, they call it, a mathematical economist. And so I spent 5 years in corporate life, and then in 1989 started my first business in New York City, 5 blocks from the old World Trade Center. A far cry from economics. It was a high-end audio salon called Hobson Ultimate Sound. And not a lot of people know about that. I don't really talk about it much, but that sort of led me on into the music world primarily. And I started a vinyl record company in 1994, and then a number of other companies thereafter. In fact, in the last 34 years, 11 plus companies that I've started. By the way, not all of which have been wholly successful, but they've all taught me something. And so the latest are this water company, Aqueen Springs. And I'll just say to people in advance that Aqueen is a native word that means peace, clarity, tranquility. And maybe we'll talk a little bit more later about why that's appropriate to where this special water that I'm shepherding to people really comes from. But as I look back, what I realize is that all of what I just described as my history seems a little pretty diverse, but it's all related to what Nikola Tesla would say, if you want to understand the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. And of course, as you well know from your background, that music and sound and everything in the world is vibrating, including all of the cells in our bodies, and we're spinning at 1,000 miles an hour if you're at the equator and so forth. So everything's vibrating. There's nothing that's actually still, and that's pretty important. Even our thoughts are vibratory patterns. So that lays the groundwork for where I'm at right now.
Interesting. So what was kind of like your first introduction into the fascination of water?
Well, that's another interesting side story that I've told a few people before. So I mentioned the vinyl record company, which was kind of called Classic Records, and I sold that company in 2010. But so somewhere between 1994, probably pretty early on, I'm going to guess about 1999, maybe 5 years in, someone in an interview asked me, because they knew that I'd started some other businesses, like, so what's next? And without hesitation and without any thought that I'm aware of to this moment, I said, well, I'm not sure, but I think it has something to do with water. And the reason that's so unusual is that prior to that, even really prior to that statement, and I mean this hand on heart, that, I really wasn't a water guy. Like, I have to sheepishly admit, like, I didn't, like, in other words, I wasn't an Evian drinker or, insisting on special water or having these amazing filters or like focused on the how important, I really didn't know how important water is. In fact, frankly, then I didn't know that molecularly we're, 80% or 85% water when we're born. And when we die, we're about 65% water, right? So you go, oh my goodness, and then that's actually by volume. Sorry. Molecularly, we're 99.9% water, right? So water is the basis for life. In fact, I have an old saying now that is, life is water dancing to the tune of nature, right? Because right now I'm water talking to water. So there's something there. I just didn't know it at the time. So I don't know how I came to it in that way. I look back and the best thing I can say is that it came through me somehow what my path was and where I was going to end up.
Yeah. So it's almost like you had a subconscious lightning bolt.
Yeah.
So what was the next stage of that? Because obviously you had that statement that came out of you, but then there must have been the next stage to actually move forwards.
Absolutely. However, this is even better. It didn't happen immediately. So it wasn't like, oh, okay, let me go and look into water. I think, again, as I look back, there were moments where I would have this thought, and I'm talking about over the next few years, right? So if you think about it, let's just say it was 1999, and I think at this point in 2023, I've been involved in water, let's call it 13 years. So, that's 2010, somewhere around there. So there was, a decade where, I didn't really pursue water, right? But at the same time, occasionally it would come to me like, I wonder what it is with water. Is it geothermic? Is it something to do with producing energy? Who knows? So I really didn't pursue it for a while. And then, interestingly, I'm a hiker. I used to be a runner back in the day and decided that we weren't really designed to run, so that I would hike. And I was coming down, I live near the Hollywood sign in Los Angeles, and there's some hiking in the hills around there, really quite nice, all over Southern California and California generally. So I was coming back from a hike, and I was coming down the hill to my house, and a car passed me. And as I looked into the car and I saw someone that I knew. In fact, it was a recording engineer whose name is Paul DeGray, quite well known here in Los Angeles, been around for many years. In fact, we're born 8 days apart. It's kind of a funny thing. And so Paul and I had collaborated on a recording that we did when I owned Classic Records in the mid 90s, like 1998 or so. We did this recording of this woman called Lorna Hunt, and the record's called All in One Day. Anyway, so I hadn't seen Paul in many years. And so we stopped, and it's like instantly, "Hey man, how are you?" He said, "I'm just coming back from a hike." I said, "Me too." And so we agreed to get together. And when we got together, there was we went for a hike. And at the end of the hike, it was a warm day, I remember, he had this jug of water. And he said, "Hey, you want some water?" And I opened this water and took a little drink of it and so forth. And took another drink, and he's driving me home. And I said, "Paul, is there something about this water?" And he goes, "Why? What do you think?" And I said, "Well, I've got this, I'm really feeling really like clear right now." Like, he said, "Well, it turns out that this water had been dosed with a form of structured water." Mm. And he said that's one of the characteristics of this, is that it kind of has you feel more clear and focused and so forth. For me now, when I look back at it, that was a sign for me to, okay, it's time to start looking into water. And so I started doing that. And then I went online and I went, oh my goodness. If you do a search anywhere on YouTube or on water, you could spend from now 3 or 4 lifetimes going through what is online. So I was a little overwhelmed at first. And then I looked at this video done by a guy called Gerald Pollack, who is a world-renowned water expert at the University of Washington in Seattle. And I watched a couple of his videos, and I thought, this guy I resonate with this guy, makes a lot of sense and so forth, and it's really interesting stuff. So, I called him up, and I said, "Dr. Pollack, I'd like to meet you." And he said, "Well, as a matter of fact, in a couple of weeks, I'm going to be in BC, in Vancouver, and I'm going to give a presentation." I said, "Okay, well, I'll come up." So I booked a ticket to Vancouver in February, in the winter. It's bitterly cold. And I show up at this hotel. I didn't make a reservation at the conference. I didn't even know what the conference was, I'm sheepish to admit. And it turns out that it was a conference of massage therapists. And he's speaking to a conference of massage therapists. Turns out that his background in bioengineering, in the department that he's in there, is in muscles, right? And muscle contraction and so forth. So he was talking about the importance of water, and in fact, structured water, in terms of muscle contraction, and how, our electrical neurons and so forth fire, but the water in the muscle has to be in a particular crystalline form in order for that muscle contraction to happen. Mm. So I saw this fascinating presentation, which I've never seen him do again before or after, right? He's now a good friend of mine. And we sat the next morning and talked about water, and that was the beginning.
So what was the next step? So that really, really sparked your kind of curiosity.
Yeah.
What was the next step for you?
So, I was still running a number of other businesses and so forth. And really, it was focused around some of the work that Jerry Pollack does. and is renowned for, which is this so-called fourth phase of water. And there's a book by the same name that I highly recommend to people because it really does help us understand how miraculous this molecule, these two hydrogens bound to an oxygen in bulk, has such a profound biological impact to build what I refer to as this vessel that we inhabit, that our consciousness is able to sense, our five senses, at least five senses, and to be able to have these conversations and to pursue, our missions and so on. So, I started with the collaboration with and the deep dive into what you could call the science of water, right? Like, what are the different properties of water? And in particular, this connection between the nature of the water that's inside the cells in our body, the water that's around the microtubules in a cell and around the DNA and around the proteins and so forth, is not your water that comes out of the tap or that comes out of a spring for that matter. So it's in a structured form. It's in a crystalline form that is in some ways very much related to the structure, the hexagonal structure of quartz crystal and of silica, which is the basis for quartz. And of course, we know that silica is also the basis for semiconductors. So you can start to think about the system that we call the human body as a semiconductor. We're electric, and water is the medium. The structured water is the medium through which our body communicates. Our cells communicate with each other, our organs. The brain communicates with the heart, and the heart communicates with the brain, and our neurological systems, and the water, this crystalline water around proteins is important for protein folding. It's important for photonic communication between cells, electromagnetic communication between cells, vibratory communication within and between cells. So that's where I sort of entered this fray with regard to, my pursuit of water in this, we'll call it ocean of different things that you can find in the internet, for example, or in books about water.
So a lot of what you learn is, to a degree, is self-study, really. It's not like there's official courses on water out there. I guess there's not many, if there are any.
Yeah, I mean, most pursuits of water are, in the world of geology, or hydrology, or, looking at the system of how water comes, the so-called hydrologic cycle and so forth. And then, there are some people in specialized departments that, like Pollock and followers, who are looking into water. But interestingly, I think more recently, biologists have started to appreciate, and geneticists and others have started to appreciate that water plays this crucial role. But up until recently, and even still hesitantly, I would say, people in biology have not really recognized the absolute critical nature of water in the biological realm.
Yeah. I mean, some years ago, I read Dr. Batman-Gielich's book on water.
Yes.
And then obviously there's the work of Dr. Emoto,
of course,
which most people are aware of, which is really interesting. But I think what you're talking about is something completely different, isn't it, really? I mean, I suppose Dr. Emoto's work is in some ways similar, but still there's a difference, particularly when you're talking about structured water. That's kind of different from either of those guys. And we'll come back to that later. But one of
Sure.
the things you mentioned was silica. So
Yeah.
could you explain a bit more about what silica actually is and why that's important?
Yes. So, as I mentioned before, something that I was unaware of, which is a nice way to put it, I would say ignorant of is a more accurate way to describe it. And that is that when I mentioned that when we start out as grapes, as children, right, 85% water by volume, and we end up at 65% water in old age as raisins, you could look at that process of aging as being a process of dehydration, or at least, those two travel together. What I didn't know even after that but I've come to understand, is that we lose silica over the course of our lifetimes as well. And so at the end of life, it's fair to say, I think, silica deficient. Now, what's the ramification of that? So it turns out silica, and let me just be a little geeky here, because if you look in the periodic table, silicon is the element that's identified there. However, silicon, like hydrogen, as an example, do not like to be on their own. I call them lonely bachelors. And they really like to be coupled, right? So hydrogen likes to couple to, water, to oxygen, for example, and make water, or hydrocarbons or whatever. It turns out silica is in the same boat. And so naturally occurring silicon is bound up almost always with another molecule, most often oxygen. So it's in the form of what's referred to as silica dioxide, SiO2, right? For those that love chemistry. And so silica dioxide, or silica for short, is actually a trace mineral that is critical for human beings, plants and animals. In human beings, it's the basis for skin, hair, teeth, our connective tissue, collagen, our extracellular matrix. Silica binds to the walls of our arteries and blood vessels and capillaries to help with blood flow. It's known to be beneficial for gut health and digestion, for cardiovascular health and well-being. So there's a few things that silica is important for. And so if you look at the difference between children and old people, you notice that old people have wrinkled skin, their bones are brittle, their hair may not be at its best. Sometimes there's issues with wound healing, another thing that silica is helpful for. And so you can sort of see that silica is at least part of that process of let's call it, lack of our optimal state when we reach old age most often. So I think, if anything, I would say it's a plug for silica, however you get that. And of course, the one way to get silica is through eating plants, vegetables, and fruits. And that's because they uptake silica from the Earth's crust, and then we eat it. And so on some level, that silica is bioavailable. Turns out that the most bioavailable way of consuming silica is in water. So if one were to drink high silica content water, that would definitely benefit all of those areas that I mentioned. There's one other area that I wanted to bring up that has become identified more recently, mostly around a guy called Christopher Exley. who wrote a book about we live in the aluminum age. And it turns out, well, let me just take one little step back. Another little geeky thing that I didn't know that I want to share with people is that the number one element in the Earth's crust, and this is shocking, is oxygen. The number two element is silica. The number three element is aluminum. So it turns out that we live in what is referred to, I didn't call it this, it's referred to as the aluminum age. So aluminum's everywhere. It's in pots and pans, it's in food, it's in the air, right? And so what happens is aluminum is toxic to plants, animals, and humans. In the case of animals and humans, silica binds to aluminum and we excrete it by sweating and urination, right? In plants, they use silica to encase aluminum so that it doesn't result in inflammation, because plants can become inflamed as well. They can be ill, so to speak. All you have to do is look at a plant that's got some inflammation and it's discolored and so forth. The same with us. So it turns out in human beings, what they've started to understand in the study of chronic inflammatory diseases, which happen mostly at the end of life, not exclusively, but those include things like Alzheimer's and ALS and Parkinson's and so forth. Those are chronic inflammatory conditions that they think are at least exacerbated by aluminum toxicity. So yet another reason for us to be mindful of our silica intake.
Yeah, it's amazing really that, we don't hear more about silica based on all the things that it can potentially affect. The other thing I would just add as well is that, and I think you were kind of alluding to it, but you didn't say, with all the geoengineering that we've got going on, they're pumping huge amounts of, we call it aluminium in the UK, but
yeah, I know.
But I'm bilingual, so I understood what you meant.
Yeah.
Obviously, they're pumping tons of aluminium into the air, so we're having to breathe that in.
Yeah.
But then the other thing that a lot of people aren't aware of, that they're also in a lot of the childhood vaccines as well.
Right.
So, it's anyway. We could go down a real rabbit hole with that one, but
right.
Suffice to say that, aluminium is toxic. You really don't want that in your body at any level.
Yeah.
And so I think it's also fair to say that almost everyone's got aluminium toxicity now because you can't avoid it. Certainly if you live where I do and you look up in the sky and there's just these straight lines everywhere you look.
Right.
And what you're looking at, in part, it's not all of it, but parts of it is aluminium, and that's going to come down at some point and you're going to have to breathe that in, or that's going to be in your rainwater.
Right.
Litsa was a 30-year-old professional woman suffering from severe acne and scarring. She was in utter despair and didn't know where to turn. She worried that her partner might leave her because of her skin, and Litsa's condition was as bad as I've ever seen. Following testing, it was found that Litsa had toxoplasma, as well as food sensitivities to gluten and soy. Litsa was a great client to work with. She jumped in and followed the program almost 100% to the letter. She cut out the foods that she was sensitive to. She had infrared saunas as advised and used the recommended essential oils. After working with me, Litsa reported how much her skin had improved and how she had much more confidence. She's also gone on to marry her partner and started a family. If you would like to achieve the same kind of results as Litsa, you can now follow a comprehensive step-by-step guide in my brand new book, Eliminating Adult Acne for Good, available now from all major online bookstores and via my website at www.bodycheck.co.uk/books.
Yeah, and let's not forget that in the production processes that use aluminum, often, in the process of that heating process or in the process of finishing and so forth, I think people do take some steps to try to minimize that being exhausted into the atmosphere. But, Exley's right. We do live in the aluminum age. And so it's no surprise that from all of these different sources that we're more susceptible, especially given that, at least in general, compared to 100 years ago, we do have a longer lifespan. And so we have an opportunity to accumulate more over, over that, longer period of time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And again, that's something that I think a lot of people perhaps don't understand is that, if you do take something into your body and it is toxic, I think most people just assume, well, I just get rid of it somehow, right?
Right.
But actually, what actually happens is in a lot of cases is that the body will actually store toxins, and it's often in fat cells because it's kind of, for want of a better phrase, it's the least important tissues in the body. So you don't really want to be poisoning your organs or your glands or your nervous system. So your body does bioaccumulate toxins. So as you were saying, as you get older and older and older, there's more and more toxins building up in the body. And in the case of things like Alzheimer's that you mentioned, and again, there is definite links to not just aluminium, but other heavy metals as well in the brain.
Right.
Well, if you've got all these heavy metals in the brain causing inflammation, well, no wonder there's all these neurodegenerative diseases that are, at unprecedented levels.
Right. Right.
Which is pretty scary. So, we're going to come on to talk about the solution, but before we get there, if we can just flip back and just focus on water just for a little bit.
Sure.
And this is something that I often have, discussions with clients of mine. And that's that, a lot of people think that all water is created equal.
Right.
But can you kind of explain why that's not correct from your perspective?
Yeah. So that's actually one of the things that we try and educate people on, not just the importance of water from the standpoint that I have already mentioned, but that all water is, not the same. And while molecularly, the chemists would argue that it's just two hydrogens and an oxygen, it turns out that this miraculous molecule in bulk can take on many different forms. And in fact, it can, you alluded to, we had a conversation earlier about Matsu Emoto and the work that he did while he was alive, with showing that water, and in this case, I think if I recall correctly, it was just distilled water. It wasn't water with minerals in it. And that talking to that water, playing music to that water, even putting a note, a sticky note, let's call it, with a heart or the word love on the side of that water, sometimes putting water into a dark place and ignoring it, and then flash freezing drops of those waters to see what, if anything, was different. And what he discovered or uncovered was that all of those vibratory patterns, let's call it, from speaking to the water, or even the vibratory pattern that comes from a two-dimensional word that is taped onto the side of a glass of water, or music, which is vibratory in nature as well. Some of that information is captured in the water and causes it to take on a different structure. That is, when you take a flash freeze view of that, can be incredibly beautiful or very chaotic, right? And so if you think of it that way, you can think of water, let's say, that has been in a stressful situation, right? Let's say the water that's been through the municipal water system has probably had some twists and turns to it, literally and figuratively, and has had a lot of influences on it. And so it likely comes to us in a form that won't kill us, right? So it doesn't have bacteria in it or anything else that is specifically harmful, but it probably carries along with it some memory of from where it came. And so if you contrast that with a Queen Springs water, this silica source water in various sizes and so forth that we sell and configurations, that water comes from a spring in southern Idaho. And by the way, this is true of many different spring waters as well. I just point out that to contrast the difference in water that's come from different circumstances or has lived a different life. So the water that comes from the spring in Idaho that we package on site, and actually it never touches the atmosphere before we package it. So when you open the package and drink it, it's the first time it's touched the environment. You could think of that water as having been less influenced by maybe a chaotic environment or a history. And so it is, cleaner in an energetic way, in addition to maybe the elements that are caught up in it. Now, there's another part to this that people don't understand. I didn't know. So we all know about the hydrologic cycle, right? The main way that water gets distributed is primarily by evaporation from the oceans, but also from lakes and streams and so forth. And it forms clouds. And then under certain circumstances that are still not well understood, it pours down as rain and refills lakes and streams and aquifers. And that's the main source of water worldwide that we drink, fresh water. So that is one way that we get water. But there's another way we get water, and that is that water's made inside the earth. So remember, I mentioned earlier that the number one element in terms of volume in the Earth's crust is oxygen. But remember, there's also hydrogen bound up, as I mentioned, with mainly carbon. So it's hydrocarbons, and we normally pump that out and refine it for use in automobiles and ships and so forth. And we know all about that and the problems associated with it. But in a geothermic area, which is where the spring in Idaho is, those hydrocarbons get dissociated. So hydrogen finds itself in a state of bachelorhood again, and it's desperate to find a partner. And what does it find? The number one element in the crust, which is oxygen. So you actually get in that situation steam being formed. It's called primary water. And then that steam makes its way through the Earth's crust, picking up trace minerals. In this case, one of the primary ones is silica. And then it comes out of the ground as geothermic water at 140 degrees Fahrenheit. And so when you talk about all waters are not created equal, it is literally the case. So, and we can talk a little bit more, I think, about once you realize that water is susceptible or ready to take on or embody its environment, then some profound things can happen in our state of health and well-being that we have direct control over.
Yeah, I mean, Dr. Emoto's work for me was just so fascinating. And for anyone that's not familiar with it, his book is called Hidden Messages in Water. There's also a documentary of the same name. I think you can watch it on Gaia, I believe.
Yeah.
When I watched that, I think my first thought was, well, hang on a minute. If we're made primarily of water, and words and music can affect the way our water, for want of a better phrase, behaves, we have to be very careful with the environment that we put ourselves in, the people that are around us, even the words we use to ourselves. But also, and something that really fascinates me as well, is the music that people listen to. Now, I mean, I understand that everyone's got their own taste and everything else. That's great that everyone's got their own taste. But when I hear people listening to and really liking what I would call music that's very angry, I think, what's that doing to the water in your body? So, like grunge and death metal and maybe some gangster rap, maybe.
Yep.
I listen to that and my body just starts tightening up. And I think, how can people enjoy that? I know, a lot of people that do powerlifting, for instance, they love that kind of music. They say, well, it gets me angry. I can lift more weight, right?
Right.
But I just think, well, potentially that could be doing you a lot of harm at the same time, especially if you're in that environment a lot,
I can't agree with you more. And without any judgment with regard to what people consume or what they listen to or the environment that they put themselves in, I think you're absolutely right that everything around us affects us. Everything matters. And so when you start to think about it on the level that you just described, when we come into a museum that has works of art that inspire us, and we sit and contemplate, what we don't realize is, but is true, is that artwork, the color and its texture and all of that has a vibratory pattern, right? One thing people should understand is that all of our five senses, and probably our sixth sense, if you will, which you could refer to as the gut, or some extrasensory perceptions that I believe everybody are endowed with, we're just not aware of, are vibratory in nature, right? So when you look and you see colors through our eyes, that's a vibratory pattern. Our smell is a vibratory, taste is a vibratory pattern, right? Hearing, all of it's vibratory. So now you start to understand when you come into an environment that makes you feel uneasy, right? It's because you're taking in that vibratory pattern and it's causing some level of dis-ease. Okay, our state of ease is disrupted. And so I think that also applies to the people that we're around. If we're around people that are very challenged, that have a lot of trauma, for example, and let's say don't have are not filled with love and kindness and so forth, and that are struggling, that has an impact on us, right? When we're around people in trauma, imagine what must be going on right now in the situations in Ukraine and in Israel and Gaza and so forth, with the amount of trauma and suffering. And this is nothing about who's responsible. I'm just really talking about this on a vibratory level and what that does to the water in our bodies, which is the source of our vessel, right? And the disruption and ultimately the dis-ease that causes. And I do believe I'm in that realm of believing that we create our own illnesses, right? By virtue of what we surround ourselves with, what we consume, and even at the highest level, our thoughts. Because what are thoughts?
Yeah.
Thoughts are electrical impulses. How does that manifest itself? As a vibratory pattern in our body, right? And so when we have kind, loving thoughts, that brings a harmony to the cells and the organs and the tissue in our body. And when we're filled with negative thoughts, it does just the opposite. It's deharmonizing. And as I mentioned before, this issue, the notion of dis-ease is never far away, especially if that is something that we continue to find the environment that we find ourselves in. So it's no surprise, and it's not just anecdote, that when people go through some level of trauma, for example, a loved one passes, or a long-term companion passes, it's not at all uncommon for the other party to pass on soon thereafter, right? So I think that is that connection between water taking on vibratory patterns all around us and how we should really be mindful of, as you say, what we say, because remember, what we say is just a reflection of what we think, right? So that's a vibratory manifestation of our thoughts. And we can talk about, and that's what I'd like to go on to, unless there's some other things you want to speak about, I'd like to talk about programming water for health and well-being.
We'll come back to that in a second. I'd definitely like to talk about that. But just to kind of round off what we were talking about, again, going back to Dr. Emoto's work, I remember he was saying, like when he showed the water crystals after playing the water music by the Beatles, it was absolutely beautiful. And I can't remember, there was some classical music as well, absolutely beautiful crystals. And I think it was something like heavy metal or something like that. And they showed the crystals, and they were just ugly. They're just horrible brown, kind of deformed kind of lumps. And you just think, wow.
They were traumatized.
Yeah. Well, that's the energy coming off that kind of music. It's a very angry music, isn't it?
Well, it's got a lot of power, and it's not melodic. It has some harmony, but it's not melodic.
But the other thing I was just going to say was around 30 years ago, maybe slightly more, I stopped watching the mainstream news.
Yeah.
Because I just kept thinking every day, it's just so depressing. Like, why would anyone want to watch this stuff? Like, this was long before I got into working in my current field. And I just thought, I've had enough. I'm just going to stop watching that. Why? And I couldn't understand why anyone would want to watch it. Right. And again, especially the news over the last sort of 4 years now, you sit and watch that every day. I mean, what do you think that's doing to the water in your body?
Absolutely.
3 years ago, it was every day, oh, these many people have died, this many people have died. Even though, again, another can of worms we could potentially go down, the entire year was a normal year in terms of number of people dying across the planet. It's completely normal. But yet, everyone's sitting in their living rooms every evening listening to how many people are dying, all the hospitals are full up, even though they weren't in most places. Right. Just turn the thing off. Yeah, that's probably one of the best things you can do for your health is turn the news off.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And by the way, it's not just, the televised news. It's, social media,
it can be,
a lot of places on the internet, even, the newspaper. And I still get, the New York Times and the LA Times. And, I find myself, flipping through the pages, And I only stop on the things that are sort of interesting to me. So, I'm not reading all the details of what's going on in Ukraine and Gaza and so forth. And even on a political level, all the shenanigans that happen here and in other places. I just kind of pass by it, right? I don't let it. I think your observation is probably the same as mine. And that is, I stopped consuming about 30 years ago too, the media on television. And what I realized pretty quickly is that the world just goes on whether I'm watching the news or not, right? It didn't, but it had a good impact on me. And of late, I'll just add to this, of late, I've taken on a different understanding. We can consume some of that material. It's really how we process it. If we process it as something that feeds our fears, then it's exactly as we're talking about it. And it's exactly as you point out. It has what I would consider to be a detrimental effect on our health and well-being through the water in our bodies. But there's another way to do that. And that is, if you can look at these situations and feel a depth of empathy and compassion and love and sending love and having loving thoughts about those who are suffering, then your body does not. In fact, it's just the opposite. You can turn that into a beautiful thought that is good for your body. And by the way, I'm in the world of believing that we, like everything that we look at, also vibrate, right? We have a pattern, a resonant pattern that we vibrate. And we know this. There are different measures of looking at our biofield, at the amount of light and photons that we put out and what that pattern is, what the colors that we emit are. I mean, we're all aware of being in a room and someone comes in and feeling that something has changed. And sometimes that something that has changed is, an enlightened person, let's call it, on whatever level. And I don't mean to put somebody above somebody else. It's just their state. And we're like excited or attracted to that. On the other hand, there are sometimes we feel a disruption that's entered the room and we sort of like maybe interested, but maybe move away from it. And so I think we're doing a service when we find ways, including the water that we drink, but most importantly, the thoughts that we have in terms of our own health and well-being, but radiating that health and well-being out to others and to the universe, really, quite frankly.
Yeah, definitely. So let's move on to programming of water. Just explain to the audience what you mean by that.
Yeah, so per what we've just discussed, if water is impacted by music and it's impacted by vibratory activity, and it can store that pattern in a beautiful crystalline way or an amorphous, chaotic way, then the next step up is that simple recognition that our thoughts, our desires, our intentions are electrical vibratory patterns that are, at least, I'm not going to say created, but are initiated by the brain, and that those get transmitted to different parts of our bodies and so forth, right? And when we speak, that is just a vibratory representation of our thoughts. So you put those two things together and you say, well, goodness, why shouldn't I just take a glass of water and speak my intention to it? whatever that is. So if my intention is to heal my body, if my intention is to have more loving thoughts about myself and others, if my intention is to give up drugs or alcohol or change one of my behaviors in a way, then why shouldn't I speak that? Because that is one of those things that we're given that is very powerful. We've always known that our voice is very powerful. And of course, our body knows what our intention is, and it knows our voice pattern because it's part of us. And so you can speak to water and then drink that intention. And that vibratory pattern is picked up by the cells and tissues in your body and can affect profound change in your life. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Now,
as you were speaking then, what came to my mind was, and there's a fair amount of anecdotal evidence to suggest that if you speak to plants, they tend to grow more.
Very much so.
So I was just wondering, is that the same thing? Because obviously plants are like us; they're mainly water as well.
It's the same thing. In fact, when we speak kindly to each other, when we have kind thoughts about each other, it's a beneficial thing. That's well understood. And, with regard to plants, there are all these studies that have been done. In fact, some of which were initiated by a guy called Marcel Vogel. And a little background on him. Vogel was a scientist at IBM and in the early 70s and responsible for about 50 or more patents that IBM had with regard to recording on disk medium and so forth, the old days of hard drives, the early days of hard drives. And he kind of got bored with that, I guess, or the next step actually in his process was to look at quartz and quartz crystals and the fact that quartz crystal can hold information because of its structure. And it's also piezoelectric, and it's the basis of quartz is silica, right? So here we're back to silica again, right? And so he fashioned these things called Vogel crystals. And it's an interesting shape of a crystal that has the shape of the Great Pyramid at Giza at one end and a slightly sharper pyramidal structure at the other end. And you can program that crystal with, he calls it unconditional love, divine love, and so forth. And you can use that instrument to either heal yourself by waving it around in a certain pattern, or to heal others. And to this day, there are many people, many healers, naturopaths in the world that use Vogel crystals to heal. And so I think in that same vein, the silica in Silica Source in our bottled water, which is called Crystal Source, where you can actually see the silica crystals that have coalesced together. And when you put light into them, they start to dance in a sort of a helical fashion, almost saying, as the cap suggests, speak to me. And the reason for the silica crystals being visible is because they've been programmed vibratorily to coalesce so that you can see them in the bottled version of our water. Why? Because if I say to you, Lee, take a glass of water out of the tap and say to it, I want my gut to heal, you might say, well, Michael, I believe you. You're kind of a believable guy, but, you're going to have that level of disbelief. Like, can this really be true, right? So you might do it, but you also might have a level of disbelief, right? And whenever you have that level of suspicion or disbelief, then your intention's not as strong. So the thought is that when you can see the silica crystals and you can have an explanation around how silica along with water, can hold vibratory information, then it helps what I call suspend the disbelief that this can actually work, that you do have this superpower to heal yourself or to maintain your health, whatever it is you want. So, you can sit with that glass of water and, speak your intention to it. And then you drink it and, you're all in, or you're more in than you would be if you didn't see the silica crystals. Now, frankly, because I understand this, I've suspended my disbelief. I don't always drink the crystal source water that's got the crystals in it. I drink the regular silica source water, and I put intention on it. I go out in my backyard and I say that I'm so grateful for all of this beauty that I have and all that I've been given, and just, express that gratitude and, desire to spread that and to radiate that into my neighborhood and to the rest of the universe. And as crazy as that sounds, I drink that down and I can feel the effect on myself, and I can communicate on some level with, as you suggest, the plants in my backyard. And it's been shown by Marcel Vogel and others that you can put some sensors on the leaf of a tree and you can have a thought of that you love this plant, and the plant's beautiful, and the plant responds in a way that you can discern. Interestingly, if you have the thought that you're going to cut the leaf of the plant, then the plant reacts from the thought more than actually when you cut the leaf.
Yeah.
Right. So it expresses that. I don't know if it's fear, but it has a reaction to the thought that you're going to cut its leaf. Now, I'm not suggesting you shouldn't trim your plants or that you shouldn't eat vegetables. I'm in that world of believing that they're here to serve their purpose in the same way that we're here to serve our purpose, that we all have a mission, be it if you're a plant or a tree or a work of art or water.
Yeah, there's a really great book called The Secret Life of Plants.
Yeah.
There's another one.
And Marcel Vogel has a chapter in that book about those experiments. Right. So I highly recommend people look into that. Yeah. There's a lot of science here. Yeah. This is not, so-called woo-woo. This is solidly based in science.
Yeah. Amir was a 42-year-old professional man suffering from acne. He was overweight, suffering from low confidence, and he had very low energy levels when he first came to see me. He was also spending £400 per month on products to cover up his acne. His skin was very oily, his face and scalp were covered in acne, and he worried that it might start to affect his work. Amir was a sugar lover, and it took him some time to wean himself off of sugar, but slowly over time, Amir made the necessary changes. Upon testing his gut microbiome, it was discovered that he did have a minor imbalance of gut microbes, including Staphylococcus aureus, which is often linked to skin conditions. He had hormonal imbalances, which would have affected his energy levels, and a number of food sensitivities that may have been causing his acne. Amir was also given supplementation to help rebalance his gut microbiome and his hormones. And within a few weeks, his skin improved to the point where he had clear skin for the first time in 30 years. If you would like to achieve the same kind of result as Amir, you can now follow a comprehensive step-by-step guide in my brand new book, Eliminating Adult Acne for Good, available now from all major online bookstores and via my website at www.bodycheck.co.uk/books. And the other thing that has sprung into my mind as we've been speaking, we're talking about water, we're talking about vibration, it's also homeopathics as well, right?
It is the basis for homeopathy as well. Absolutely, 100%. So if you think about, and for those people, maybe a lot of your listeners know about how homeopathic remedies work, but effectively it starts out as some kind of molecule, an herb or something, that's put into water and then succussed. It's shaken. And then it's diluted. So like a small amount is taken from that and put into more water. It's shaken again. And then a small amount of that water. And when I say a small amount, a very small fraction. And there's the notion that after a certain number of dilutions that I just described, that there is no molecule in the homeopathic remedy from the original herb, let's call it, that was in the original solution. And so what's left? It's the vibratory pattern of whatever was put into that homeopathic remedy. And so it's the vibratory pattern that really matters.
Yeah. And that's why,
right?
A lot of, let's call it modern science, don't like homeopathics because they don't have the instruments to measure it. So therefore it doesn't exist. It's all nonsense.
Right. Now, an interesting thing that I think will help glue things together for people, for those people that are on the Western medicine, the quote, scientific pharmaceutical side of things, it's easy to throw stones at those guys. And, they live in glass houses, so it's pretty easy to do. The problem is that we don't realize is that drugs, and even scientists dispute this, the people at the pharmaceutical companies, the scientists that create these drugs, they think that it's this lock and key mechanism, right? That this is all a chemistry. But it turns out it's not. Chemistry really should be thought of from a physics standpoint. And in fact, Richard Feynman suggested that physics really is the new chemistry. It is vibratory in nature. What I'm trying to say is that pharmaceuticals act in a vibratory way as well. The problem is that it's a vibratory pattern that may have some benefits, but also, as we all well know, has some collateral damage or some side effects because that vibratory pattern is not specific to the, let's call it, opposing vibratory pattern in our body, which is the basis for the illness.
Well, the placebo effect is a good example, isn't it? Right?
Very much so.
The pharmaceutical, or even might not even be a pharmaceutical, isn't even doing a molecular job, but yet the person gets better.
Absolutely. So that's the power of our thoughts. It's the power of our belief, right? Yeah. And it's, I'm not suggesting it's easy, but the first step is to recognize that we do have these superpowers that we're endowed with and to take back the responsibility for our own health and well-being. And I think that's what people are doing as a result of all of the things that you're involved in and you report on and others. And, it doesn't start and stop with just what we put into our bodies, right? That's important.
Yeah.
But as we've talked about, the people you are around, the music you listen to, the amount of rest that you get, the thoughts that you have, right? Being around family and friends and, having that sense of community and being compassionate and empathetic towards others. That's really the course to health, well-being, and longevity from my perspective.
Yeah. One of the models, if you like, that I use in my practice is that there are 6 what we call foundational principles. The first one, the most important, is your thoughts. That's number 1. Second is breathing. Third is hydration. 4th is nutrition. 5th is movement. And 6 is sleep and rest.
You've got it. I mean, seriously, I will. That's exactly the list for me. You've really nailed it.
Yeah.
And
it's a case of if you don't have all 6 in place, you're not going to be running at your optimum level. I mean, I think in modern day in the modern day world, I think we probably need to add on one of those, which is relevant to what we're talking about as well today, and that's detoxification. Because of the world we live in, if it was 500 years ago, probably wouldn't need to use that word, but because of all the chemicals and toxins in our environment now, detoxification is probably absolutely crucial for all living beings, not just humans.
Yeah, I think that's right. Now, that said, as I look further for explanations about and looking into the superpowers that we're endowed with, that I think probably some of which we're not aware of or have never been aware of, but some have been lost. Like I firmly think that the ancients, even back to Egypt and Greece, and that they had a different understanding of how to sustain themselves. They didn't have drugs, man. So how did they do it? And I more recently I've been investigating, and I would suggest people take a look at it if they're interested, in a guy that lived in the late 1800s until 1963, a guy called Walter Russell, right? And he wrote a number of books, and in particular, if one were to read one, maybe it would be The Secret of Light, or what's called Atomic Suicide, which he wrote after the dropping of the bombs and so forth. And it's a way of looking at the world as wound up light, so that all elements of which we're made are condensed light. And so it kind of starts to put together this notion that we are beings of light, and that the sun is important for all of us, plants, animals, humans, and the planet even. And so in that world, you can start to think about the ability of us to detoxify ourselves. Because if aluminum, for example, is really bound up light in a particular pattern, right, which is different from calcium and phosphorus and silica, that we could actually desire to detox ourselves if we're aware of that and we have that thought and that intention. And there's a world of thought that we have the ability to do that as well. So as we look forward, I think that energy medicine, electrical treatments, and so forth are on the way back. They were around up until the pharmaceutical industry and the American Medical Association in the early 30s more or less banned all of electromedicine, including chiropractic, which is vibratory in nature as well, right? Moving things around. But I think we're ready to come back and understand that, we can change elements. We can detoxify the air. I predict, and there's going to be some people that think I'm completely mad, and maybe I am, that we can change carbon dioxide, that we can detoxify the environment in ways that we never really thought of before, when we understand that we're all just bound up light in this really complex form, but it's a pretty simple idea. Anyway, I throw that out as food for thought.
Well, again, if our thoughts are the most powerful thing, why wouldn't that work? Right? I mean, there are animals that, you can chop their legs off and they'll just grow another leg. Why can't we do that? Well, we can't do that probably because we don't believe we can.
I think that's part of it. Absolutely. And I do believe that there's a time coming where we will be able to treat ourselves. The new medicine will end up being the medicine of light and vibration. Already, it's already there. I mean, when I say it's there, the beginnings of it, right? There are sound baths, there are sound healings, there are light therapies, and so forth. In fact, even this is an interesting little aside. We all know about the beneficial effects of infrared radiation, right? If you go to a spa, right, a cold or a hot, a steam sauna or a dry sauna or whatever, and if you want to think about why that's beneficial for us, right? It feels good. We don't exactly know why. Well, it turns out that our heart is not capable of pumping all of the blood through our body. Now you say, "Oh, Hobson, you're crazy." It's like, no, that's true. And it's not controversial because the Russians knew about this like 30 or 40 years ago. And so the question is, how does the blood circulate in our body? And the answer is infrared radiation, right? And this comes out of some of the work that Gerald Pollack uncovered with his fourth phase of water, is that blood, which is mainly water, is in a different form that is assisted by infrared radiation. What's infrared radiation? It's light in the circulation through our blood vessels and so forth, which explains from a scientific standpoint why these therapies that involve infrared heat are beneficial.
Well, I feel even better now that I was in my infrared sauna last night.
Absolutely. It increases your blood flow, and it's really good for health and well-being.
Yeah. So there's an old saying that the best solution to pollution is dilution.
I like that.
Based on that, in your view, how much water should people be drinking each day?
That's a really good question. It's one of the main questions I get when people, at a cocktail party, ask, what do you do? And I used to be in the camp 5 years ago that you should take your body weight and divide that by 2, and that's the number of ounces of water that you should drink. So, I don't think that's a terrible rule of thumb. It ends up sending you to the bathroom quite a lot. So there's a detoxifying effect to that. And, that's probably good within reason. I'm not sure that it's absolutely necessary because there's another way that we make water. So remember that old phrase, as above, so below, right? I already talked about how water is made in the earth, right? This primary water. Well, it turns out human beings and animals make primary water too. And how do we do that? It's something called the electron transfer mechanism, which Albert St. George won the Nobel Prize for in 1937 and spoke about it. And that is carbohydrates or fat get broken down in our body as part of this so-called electron transfer mechanism, which I won't go into all the details of. But at the end of that process, 2 things are created: water and heat. And that's how we heat ourselves. That's how we maintain this temperature of 98.6 or so on average Fahrenheit of temperature. And so we are actually making water. So the process of having hydrogen in our bodies bound up with another molecule, most often carbohydrates, which are sugars, are easy to draw what we call energy from, and it's the basis for the ATP cycle and so forth, which is what we really run on. So I always wondered why, and didn't know why, there are some people that, eat a lot but don't drink a lot of water, and how they survive, how they're not dehydrated. And the answer is the body's wonderfully able to get and make its own water to be able to sustain itself. One last way that we do that is by bathing. One of the reasons why when we take a bath or a shower or we go swimming or whatever, that we feel invigorated is that, remember, the skin is a two-way process. Not only do we excrete and sweat and so forth, but we can also hydrate our skin and so forth. And that's why we feel better after a shower. So,
yeah, and a good reason not to be using chlorinated and fluoridated water
very much so. Yeah, exactly. So I didn't exactly answer it, but I will say, just to add one last thing there, is that I think it's also an environmental issue, right? If you live in a low humidity environment where there's a lot of heat, like in Southern California or in the desert, it's obvious that you're going to stress your system if you expect it to make all of the water for you. You're going to have to eat a lot, right? So you should probably be drinking more in that case. These days, my rule of thumb is probably a couple liters. That's probably the sweet spot. Might need to be more in certain circumstances. Obviously, when you exercise a lot, or if you're in a sauna, or in that environment where you're sweating, then absolutely you have to replace that. And the only last thing I would say is I would just caution people with this idea that ultra pure water, we're like conditioned to this idea that, oh God, everything has to be pristinely clean and pure and so forth. Not so. We do not run on distilled water, right? We absolutely need minerals in our body. And in fact, people can die from drinking too much distilled water at one time. Like if you drank, let's say, a gallon, I don't know if that's the exact amount, but of distilled water, or maybe more than that, you would put your body into a situation that you might end up in a near or critical condition as a result. So I would encourage people to drink water that is mineralized.
Yeah, for sure.
Right.
Yeah, I mean it's very acidic as well, isn't it, when it's distilled? Yeah,
it is.
Yeah,
yeah.
We spoke a little bit earlier about silica and aging. And at the time we were talking about that, I had a thought in my head. But do you have any ideas as to why, as people get older, they've got less silica in the body?
That's a really good question. And one of the things that seems to happen, and again, this is just anecdotal. I noticed it with my parents, that one, they didn't eat very well. So they didn't eat, they eat a lot of processed foods. They ate stuff that had lots of sugar in it and artificial stuff and so on. And also didn't eat that much sometimes. So for whatever reason, and that's something maybe there's something psychological or that goes on where the diet of people as they grow older, and maybe we're turning that around, right? But it seemed to be that was part of what happens, that it becomes a self-perpetuating spiral, that you don't have enough silica and then you don't eat the right things and you don't drink a lot of water and so forth. So you end up dehydrating and losing silica content. You've accumulated aluminum and you're accumulating more. And so you get this chronic inflammation and it just becomes this, well, let's call it a death spiral.
Yeah, I kind of see, and again, when you were talking about your parents, my parents were born during the Second World War. So, even after the Second World War in the UK, we had rationing, right? So you couldn't just go out and buy whatever food you wanted. You had, I think, ration books, and you could go. You might get one piece of meat a week or one slab of butter a week, things like that. And I think, obviously as it got to the sort of 60s and 70s, now, in the 50s, something like sugar would have been a real kind of rare thing, right? You get to the 60s and 70s, and now there's almost an abundance of sugar and stuff like that they'd never had before. So I think there's a certain psychological aspect of, well, this is amazing because, we didn't have this growing up kind of thing. And it at a subconscious level.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the other thing to add to that is what I was thinking earlier is obviously as you get older, generally speaking, you generally become less efficient at absorbing nutrients. So even if you are, for instance, eating a good diet, maybe your stomach isn't producing as much hydrochloric acid as it used to. Maybe you don't have as much enzyme activity, things like that. That was kind of my thought as to why that might be the case. And also, I guess, again, I'm talking kind of in general terms, most people that are elderly now with things like Alzheimer's have probably been drinking chlorinated water their entire life as well, rather than a good quality water.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly true in the United States. I think it's less true in Europe. One of the observations traveling through Europe for the past 35 or 40 years has been that there's a lot of bottled water and good bottled water that's consumed. There's the spring water industry is alive and well in Europe. And so they're, I think they are consuming, in some cases, pretty good water.
I mean, Evian's probably the biggest brand in Europe.
Yeah,
I drank a lot of Evian in the past, but it's good. It's a good quality water. So in terms of how people can maximize their health, if you were going to leave the audience with your top 3 tips, what would they be?
Well, I mean, I think it really mirrors what you said. By far, I mean this sincerely, by far at the top of the list is be very mindful of your thoughts. Really try, and I'm not telling people anything they don't sort of already instinctively know or have experienced, or that there's a gazillion, gurus and self-help people and so forth who have written books and who do TED Talks and so forth. It's like, let your heart and your body be filled with love for yourself first, put the love mask on yourself first, but then, spread the love, right? I mean, the Beatles had it right. All you need is love. And that's a thought. It's a vibration, right? So I think that is the first, most important thing people can do. And I would agree that breathing is absolutely vital. In fact, one thing that I've been doing, there's a book that was written by this guy, James Nestor, called Breath. And there's a bunch of other guys that have written really good books too. And I've looked into those, and the idea that we breathe quite a lot through our mouth as opposed to through our nose. And there's a reason for this thing being shaped in the way that it is. And the construction of the tissues inside of the nose actually is responsible for nitric oxide production. Remember, air that we breathe is about 70+% nitrogen and only about 23% oxygen. So that process, nitric oxide, is really important to our health and well-being. And it turns out that when you breathe through your mouth, you don't develop nitric oxide. So you're deficient in nitric oxide if you breathe through your mouth. A lot of people, have sleep apnea. They sleep with their mouth open. And I take a little piece of tape, not duct tape, because that's aggressive, but they make this surgical tape that's not so bad, or even the blue tape that painters use. It's kind of tingly when you take it off, but it's fine. But that process of mindfully breathing through your nose as opposed to your mouth, even during exercise, is really, really critical. And then I would say probably water. The water that you drink, be mindful of that. Make sure that it's from a good source. And then along with that, eat a lot of vegetables that have silica in them. I would again go in the organic way to stay away from pesticides and artificial ingredients. Never forget, pesticides and artificial ingredients are just different molecules that have a different vibratory pattern that when we ingest them, bring a level of dis-ease to our system. It's as simple as that. So just stay away from those bad vibes, right? So that might have been 3.5 things, but
excellent. And what's next for you, Michael?
Well, so, it's bringing awareness to Queen Springs water. And in fact, I think we've set up a special code. If people want to try a Queen Springs water, they can go to our website, and in the checkout, I believe there's a promo code, and it's
Radical Health.
What
10.
did we decide that it was? Radical Health 10. If you put that in, you'll get a 10% discount. And, I would have people try that. So part of my mission is to continue to make people aware of the importance of water, and how it is critical to our health, well-being, and longevity. And I'm also involved in something I've been working on for 5 years or so, which won't be a surprise, which is delivering through a wearable, a garment that has electrodes in it, different patterns, electrical patterns. Because remember, electrical patterns are vibratory in nature as well, but delivering electrical patterns to the body that can result in an assistance in returning the cells and tissues to a harmonic state. Now, you still will need to have good thoughts to go along with that, because remember, the thoughts are what overrides everything, or tries to override everything. But sometimes when we're in a state of a really compromised state, then we do need some stimulation or some, let's call it retuning. That's the way I like to think about it, so that we can then regain control of that activity. And if you are in a state of ease or in harmony, then delivering sympathetic sounds, let's call it, to the body can help maintain that process. So that's another business that I'm involved. It's number 12.
And
actually.
what's the web address for the water?
So that's aquenesprings.com, and that's spelled AQUENE springs.com. And as I mentioned at the onset, a queen in native terms is synonymous with clarity, peace, and tranquility.
That sounds great. And what about social media? Is your company on social media?
Yeah, we have all the, Instagram, Twitter, and
that's
Facebook.
At Queen Springs. Great. I'll make
Yes.
sure all the details are in the show notes as well, but it's always good to give it a little shout out.
That's great. Thank you so much. It has been such an honor and a pleasure to be able to speak with you. It seems as though there's a real resonance between, our approaches. And so, I laud your efforts to bring that message to an audience that is interested in elevating their game.
Well, Michael, back at you. I mean, thank you for coming on and sharing with the audience. And I've, really enjoyed the last hour and a half. It's flown by.
I'm just really grateful. Thank you for all you do. And please, everybody out there, just have beautiful, beautiful thoughts about yourself and everything and everyone around you.
Well, I think that's an absolutely amazing way to close the show. So that's all from Michael and me for this week. But don't forget, you can join me same time, same place next week on the Radical Health Rebel podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Remember to give the show a rating and a review, and I'll see you next time.